Psychoanalysis course, Story of Psychoanalysis, Episode 1. Namaste. It is a moment of a great moment. Journey till now has been in the deep and difficult intellectual realms of psychoanalysis. We now move to the academic study of psychoanalysis. Studying psychoanalysis has always been a dear affair. Our journey in the series we start today, namely Psychoanalysis course, will democratize access to psychoanalysis, especially for those with humble beginnings. In this series, we shall take up one school of psychoanalysis and complete it before we move on to the next. Station today is of Perspective, the story of psychoanalysis, with guide none other than Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So, how do we see today the advent of psychoanalysis in the history of ideas?
In the history of ideas, it's a moment of great moment, as you said. Freud is to humanities and social sciences what Einstein is to physics. His pioneering work in that sense is of that significance. In the history of ideas, if you try to trace as to how Freud could happen, one component, of course, is the genius of Freud and his destiny. But if you were to trace the evolution, we see continuation from many other people that Freud worked with. It also is partly because of his time. Let us take a few reasons how Freud could make psychoanalysis happen apart from his genius. First important point is he was working at a time where for most sicknesses there was no allopathic cure of a reliable type. They were trying to control with great effort and not succeeding much in it. So it was the right time to try out something new because there were limitations of what existed. So this was the first part, that he was trained as a neurologist and he realized very soon that there are limitations of what he can do with his knowledge. So something had to be tried out. If not him, somebody else would have tried something, and that something could have been anything. And that was one sort of spirit of the time elements that went into the advent of psychoanalysis, that there was nothing to lose by trying out something new because of the limitations of what existed. Second important element in the advent moment is of Freud's working with Charcot and Breuer. Both of them used hypnosis. And when they used hypnosis, the idea of unconscious was not elaborated so specifically, but it was encountered in that way, in an operational way. So without conceptualizing it in an operational way, the idea of unconscious was already on a roll. The third element was Freud's own analysis of himself. As destiny would have it, Freud had all the difficulties of a neurotic patient. And for 7 years or almost 7 to 8 years, he was suffering from anxiety, neurosis, convulsions of hysterical type, all sorts of things. And he calls this period of self-analysis as the splendid isolation. And in this duration of the splendid isolation, which is very much like what Jung would later call Nekia, Jung's splendid isolation, that in Freud's own analysis of himself, many of the principles of psychoanalysis got formulated. So it was a spirit of the times, it was his work with Charcot and Breuer, and it was his own analysis because of his own troubles, which did not have any cure in that given time in the prevailing scheme of knowledge of medicine. Philosophically, if we look at it in terms of the role of history of ideas, the story of psychoanalysis essentially is the story of the unconscious. And the story of unconscious is not new. What is new is to systematically build a school of psychotherapy upon it and detail it out in a systematic way and find its clinical application and get results. That is new. The idea of unconscious is not completely new. If we go into Western philosophy, we find Freud preceded by Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. In fact, Schopenhauer used to say, men feel they are drawn from in the front, but in fact they are pushed from behind. And there is a will, the will to live and the will to pleasure and the will to power, which is pushing us from behind. And from where it is pushing us, that is outside of our awareness and control. So the idea of unconscious was implicit in Schopenhauer. The idea of unconscious also was implicit in Nietzsche. In fact, Freud read Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche more than Schopenhauer, and he used to say that my reading of Nietzsche is loaded with resisting what he said, because many of the ideas that he was discovering were already there in Nietzsche. And he did not want to encounter the fact that what he's doing is not something great and new. So he was resisting reading Nietzsche. If we go to the Eastern philosophy, the idea of unconscious even dates back thousands of years before Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. In Hindu psychology, if you look at the model of the mind in yoga or model of the mind in tantra, the idea of unconscious is very ancient. In Sanskrit, it was termed as Sushuptaman or Avchetan. And this idea of Sushuptaman or Avchetan was very old. It's almost an ancient idea. So in the history of ideas, when we see the role of it, the idea of unconscious is not new. What is new is a systematic creation of an applied school of clinical psychology. So that is something that Freud did, and it was his genius that he did it. The advent of psychoanalysis in the second half of Freud, like you can divide Freud into the early Freud and the late Freud, also had to do with the Second World War making Freud take a turn from early Freud to the late Freud. And therefore, the later part of Freud's work is also influenced by what he experienced as a therapist and as an individual in the context of the Second World War. So this is how the advent happened. And in terms of people, the advent of psychoanalysis was marked by exit of some of the most promising collaborators of Freud. So Freud had this cyclical repeating thing in him that he would be infatuated with somebody, get very close to somebody, collaborate, and then fight with him and separate. And somewhere in one of his letters, he remarks that it seems my inner emotional life demands existence of a deeply loved friend and a deeply loved enemy at the same time. So Freud's own dynamics also played out, that he was very rigid, very almost fanatical about his ideas. And not completely wrong, because psychoanalysis in its initial years was opposing everything that was around it. And therefore, there was a struggle for survival of psychoanalysis. And when you are attacked by everybody trying to annihilate you, in that struggle of annihilation and survival, it's natural that you develop a siege mentality. That you are inside a fortress and everybody outside is trying to annihilate you. And when you are in such a siege mentality, you can't tolerate dissent. You have to have some sort of uniformity, obedience, allegiance, almost a devotion to the cause, so that the cause can be defended. And Freud used to say, even 100 years from now, psychoanalysis will be opposed out of the unconscious anxiety and rage it unleashes. And that we see prophetically is true even today. That more than 100 years after the advent of psychoanalysis, we still see live apart laymen, even professionals, having blind hatred to psychoanalysis and Freud out of their own inner dynamics.
True.
So in that context, it was not unnatural for Freud, because Freud was persecuted both individually as a Jew and as a professional by the entire community of medical professionals and other psychologists of those times. So the advent was also marked by Freud fanatically defending his work, not allowing any dissent, and in the process, many of the best minds like Jung, Adler, Ferenczi, Wilhelm Reich, they finally had to leave Freud and walk their own path. So it's a very eventful, very interesting point of genesis, the advent of psychoanalysis. As a historical period, it's a very eventful period, intellectually and personally, between the geniuses who were involved at the very top of the enterprise.
True. So, can we go into how Freud ended up creating psychoanalysis? What made him think that this can be the model and this is how analysis would be done, the theories?
Melzer says a very good thing about psychoanalysis. He says, if it is not autobiographical enough, it is not psychoanalytic enough. So
Right.
every school of psychoanalysis has its genesis in autobiographical exploration of oneself. Jung explored himself and created the Jungian school. Klein explored herself and her patients and created the Kleinian school. Similarly, Freud explored himself, his years of splendid isolation, as well as the patients, and psychoanalysis got created. So Freud started his journey with Charcot and Brewer, and he started with hypnosis, and one important insight came out of that, and the insight was this, that if we look at sicknesses, something important comes up in the context of looking at sicknesses, and that is this, that the materialistic model of being hardwired, that everything just comes from the genes, that everything is biochemical upwards, and that thoughts, feelings, and emotions are epiphenomena of the material process, and it's a one-way traffic. That does not hold good. Because Freud found that what on the surface looks like a physiological symptom can go away by the person talking about it, by the person feeling about some incident where it started, which created this fundamental insight that if not all pathology, at least a section of pathology is a two-way street. That without the use of biochemicals, by psychological processes of human experience, of human discussion, of human feeling, of feeling safe, you can reverse a physiological symptom. And this created a model of the human system that it is not all hardwired inside out. Outside in is as much a possibility as inside out. And this created a picture of sickness where sicknesses were originating primarily from 5 sources. One was a physical source. I go out and some car bumps into me and my bone breaks. It's a purely physical event that can cause sickness. my genes are defective and I don't develop certain parts of the brain in a normal way. So there's a genetic source of sickness. I eat something wrong, or I don't exercise or don't walk, and I develop a sickness. It's a lifestyle source of sickness. There is a pathogen of malaria and a mosquito bites me, or there is a pathogen of COVID and it goes in and it creates a sickness. That's a pathogen-driven sickness. But the fifth category of sickness was very interesting. That I suffer a psychological trauma and I develop a sickness. And this category of sickness was distinct from the other four. And this category of sickness can easily be reversed, not easily, but it can be reversed by a psychological treatment without involving any neurochemicals. Now, creating this kind of this coming to the surface of this particular fact was very important for Freud and for everybody else thereafter. Today, we have a range of sicknesses called the psychosomatic. But in early days, this was very important to Freud, that this actually can happen, that there is a category of sicknesses which is psychologically rooted and can be healed psychologically. And it is a two-way process. Through human experience, you can make the inner physiological processes undergo a change. So that was very important to Freud. And then Freud developed later, he found that everyone cannot be hypnotized, and the suggestions given in hypnosis or experiences in hypnosis may be short-lived. So he went on to a method of free association and developed the whole thing. And this went on for quite some time, and then he started analyzing his own dreams, and then came out the interpretation of dreams, in which many of the dreams are of the patients and many of the dreams are of his own. And given the fact that he grew up with a very young mother, because his mother was not the first wife of his father. So he grew up with a very young mother who doted on him, and in that way he was destined to get into Oedipal entanglement. And so the Oedipal component would come out very clearly in his dreams as he set out to dream analyze himself. So this went on completely till the early Freud. And then after the Second World War, we see the later Freud. The first part of Freud, the idea was, there were three fundamental ideas. The first idea was that pathology is rooted in the unconscious, and the way to heal it is to make the idea of the unconscious conscious and release the feelings associated with the idea. So there is understanding of the idea consciously and release of the feelings called catharsis. So this was fundamental, and opposing this were forces of repression. So this was the fundamental idea. And the second idea was of the hydraulic model, that there is libido or life energy loaded in a memory, and when you undergo catharsis, that memory, that feeling is released. It's like a hydraulic model. The pressure is relieved and it becomes conscious, or it becomes harmless. What he said was reminiscences convert into remembrances. So this was the second fundamental part. And the third fundamental part was the slip of the unconscious. That despite all the repression, the unconscious leaks out in therapy, in art, in dreams, in slips, and in hypnosis. So this leaking out of the unconscious, despite the best of repression, is something very fundamental to him. And this went on for, and the model here was of essentially of the force of libido, the force of pleasure and survival, and the force of aggression. So it was pleasure, survival and pleasure. Survival will give rise to aggression, and libido, the eros, would give rise to the maximization of pleasure and avoidance of pain. And this continued till almost Second World War. And then the turn was taken where he conceptualized death instinct. And this inverted a lot of things. So the later Freud then is very different from the early Freud, and it went on. And then when Jung separated from him and Adler separated from him, they created their own schools of psychoanalysis, almost parallel to Freud. And Wilhelm Reich separated and he created his own school. So we had Adler, who had taken in more of the socialist inputs. We had Jung, who went more into a design by nature approach. And he was not in favor of the tabula rasa theory like Freud. And we had Wilhelm Reich, who went more on the life energy approach. And Wilhelm Reich was very close, in fact, in many ways, to the yogic approach. So this is how the psychoanalytic schools got created. And towards the end of it, Freud's life, Klein came in and she created her own school. And then Winnicott came. But if you look at the early Advent period, it essentially was Freud, Jung, Adler, and Wilhelm Reich. To some extent, Ferenczi. So this is how the early days psychoanalysis got created. The schools actually got created very early.
So going into his journey without getting into the concepts, how was it?
His journey was a very difficult journey because entire period of the first part of psychoanalysis, the first battles were fought by Freud alone. Everyone else essentially was an apprentice. Jung, Adler, Ferenczi, Reich, all of them essentially were apprentices of Freud. And Freud was leading the battle. It was a very hard time. Financially, intellectually, his own health-wise, it was a very hard time for Freud. But he was almost possessed by this, what Jung calls the creative demon, that he just could not stop thinking and conceptualizing and developing psychoanalysis. He was overtaken by that desire, completely overwhelmed. And if you put all the stresses together, the intellectual stress, the health stress, the financial stress, the attacks and the dismissal by the colleagues, Freud, for quite a period of his life, he led a very life full of struggle and turmoil. And it comes out in one of the statements he made. Once they were in a seminar type of situation, the leading lights of psychoanalysis had come together, and Freud, of course, was leading the meeting. And after the meeting was over, as everyone was going out, Freud fell down. Freud had a hysterical fit and he fell down. And Jung was there in the room, so he tried to help him and lifted his head. And Freud said to him, "How sweet it will be to die." He was so tormented by the turmoil in his own mind. So it was a very difficult period. The similar thing was faced by Jung. Yeah. So even when Jung separated and he created his own school, he had to fight similar battles like Freud. And in addition to others, he had to fight Freud himself. And similarly, we had Adler trying to bring in Marxism and
एक minute.
so we see Freud fighting his own battle, Jung fighting his own, Adler fighting his own, Ferenczi and Reich fighting their own battles. So in a sense, it was a all-out battle for all schools of psychoanalysis in that initial period. And we see that actually is carried on for a long time till I think psychoanalysis reached its peak. And that was I would say, 40s to 70s, that was a peak period. And then again, the battle of psychoanalysis in a much muted way, I would say, and a more lighter way, again started till Lacan came in. So in that sense, if you look only at the Advent years, it was an all-out battle of all schools, almost a battle of annihilation in the initial days.
So, riding the rise and fall of psychoanalysis, can we go into the story of psychoanalysis?
Phase 1 was a struggle for survival. Phase 2 was the peak of psychoanalysis, the rise of it. And the rise was so much that people used to say that it's not only a theory, but an atmosphere of opinion about both psychoanalysis and Freud. It was almost, as the German word says, Weltanschauung, a complete worldview. And psychoanalysis had positioned itself as a mother science in the zone of the mind, as a foundational science to all of the humanities and social sciences. If you look at DSM-1 and DSM-2, they are informed heavily with psychoanalysis. It was later on that DSM became theoretical. But the first couple of DSMs were heavily loaded with psychoanalysis. The language of psychoanalysis was the language of mental health, the language of neurosis, borderline, and psychosis. So today we have the language of DSM as the language of mental health. But at that time, the language of psychoanalysis was the language of mental health. And those were the heydays of 5 days a week, 5 years kind of psychoanalysis. And we had movies, we had art, we had mythology interpreted with psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis getting in dialogue with practically the whole of humanities and social sciences. And then came the fall of psychoanalysis. And the fall is a post-70 phenomenon. And the fall essentially came out of the rigidity and fanaticism of psychoanalysis. One by one, the rigidities of psychoanalysis led to creation of different schools of psychotherapy. Psychoanalysis rejected the power of the conscious mind and the will in healing psychopathology. For psychoanalysis, it was secondary. The unconscious was primary. But psychoanalysis could never accept that the conscious mind also could be helpful in healing of certain pathologies, that the use of will can also be helpful. And that gave rise to cognitive therapy. Then psychoanalysis discounted the power of behavior. It felt it was always inside out. Behavior can never bring in change in the unconscious. So it was not a two-way traffic, which was a mistake. And that gave rise to behavioral therapy. And then the two came together to create CBT, the cognitive therapy and the behavioral therapy. That was one area that psychoanalysis could not be open and flexible, and therefore a competitor came up. The second component was related to the idea of using superego and the power of superego and the pleasure of superego. That we always saw superego as a source of problem, superego pathology, but never as a source of happiness or source of strength. And therefore, logotherapy came up, which essentially is harvesting the superego strength by giving oneself a purpose. Similarly, we could not think about concretizing anything. It was all in terms of words. But concretizing it helps many people, and therefore psychodrama came up. We could not conceptualize of using art for therapy, and therefore art therapy came up. We could not conceptualize of using psychedelics, and therefore a whole range of psychedelic-led therapies came up. We could not conceptualize of using Indian spirituality, and therefore meditation, spirituality involving schools came up. So because of our rigidity, slowly these competitors came up. And that is where the decline started, that we would refuse to accept our limitations. One component. Second component was we did not have Freud and Jung after Freud and Jung. So there was a deficit of genius. There was a second component. The third was the self-righteous rigidity, the fanaticism. Because we must remember that there is a fundamental difference between the Western civilization and the East. The Eastern civilization is based upon pluralism, and the Western civilization is based upon singularism. So you first had the Greek period only of reason, then the Christian period only of faith, and then the modern period only of empirical science. But there is always an or situation, never an and situation. This or this, never this and this. And because psychoanalysis is a product of modernity, and modernity is a product of Western civilization, and Western civilization is a product of singularism, I am not surprised at the fanaticism of psychoanalysis as it was in those days. So this led to the fall of psychoanalysis, not to mention the cost and the time. People wanted something cheaper, something quicker, something less esoteric. And that led to a fall of psychoanalysis and the rise of what I call the healing packages. So there became two layers, a layer of theoreticians like Freud, Klein, Jung, Winnicott, Kohut, right? And on top of it, technicians who would use the work of theoreticians to create packages. So some will create a package for the inner child, some will create a psychodrama package, some will create a package for shadow healing, some will create a package for well-being. So the packages became more accessible and more understandable to the layman because the fundamental theory was too deep and too difficult and too costly and too long. So there the fall came, and today we are on the margins. Psychoanalysis is no longer at the center of the psychotherapy world, but it still remains the most comprehensive and the deepest theory of the mind. And when other theories fail, other approaches fail, there is no way out but psychoanalysis in the most difficult of cases. So deep cases, chronic cases, they all need psychoanalysis, and it's difficult to cure them without using psychoanalysis. So we remain marginal, but a very important component of the psychotherapy world, and the only way to go for most difficult problems, and the most comprehensive theory of the mind that is there. So that is how we are situated. And one important part, there is always, after every 30 years, a rise of psychoanalysis. Back to Freud, back to psychoanalysis. That cycle always happens because the fundamentals are deep, and some of the fundamentals are forever true. We have 1 minute to go. Should we continue in the second part?
We move on to the part two of the same.